The briefing room held the controlled atmosphere of professional military planning. Maps covered the table. Intelligence overlays showed target locations, confirmed sightings, and the geometry of the operation about to unfold. The men in the room represented different nations and different service branches, all focused on a shared objective, the elimination or capture of a specific insurgent target operating in the Hindu Kush. The planning process followed the established methodology. Routes were analyzed. Timings were synchronized. Contingencies were worked through. Each element of the operation received scrutiny. And among those elements was the consideration of a long-range shot, a sniper engagement from a distance that planners assessed to be at the extreme edge of feasibility or perhaps beyond it. The distance itself was substantial. Accounts from those present described the range as approximately 800 meters, perhaps somewhat more depending on the precise positioning and the exact location of the target. At that distance, a great many factors become material constraints rather than minor considerations. Wind, which might be a secondary factor at 200 meters, becomes a dominant variable at 800. The velocity of the bullet over such a distance means that wind drift can easily exceed the vertical size of a human target. A 10-mile-per-hour crosswind at 800 meters creates a deflection of more than a meter, depending on the ballistic characteristics of the specific round and rifle combination being employed. Moving targets, and in an operation against insurgent personnel, the likelihood of movement increases with distance because the target has more time to react to the presence of threat, become exponentially more difficult to engage with precision. The calculations for bullet drop over such a distance are not negligible. They are substantial and demand precise knowledge of the environmental conditions at every point along the trajectory. The planning team considered the shot in detail, as serious planning processes demand. Ballistic specialists were consulted. Wind conditions for the anticipated time of the operation were analyzed based on historical weather data for the region and the season. The probability of a successful engagement was computed using models that incorporated the uncertainty in all the variables. According to accounts from those involved, the calculation was conducted rigorously and the conclusion was clear. The probability of a successful engagement was unacceptably low when all the uncertainties were accounted for. The consensus formed in that briefing room reflected the thinking of professional planners. The range was too great, the conditions too uncertain, the probability of success too slim to justify including the shot in the operation plan. The formal decision emerged from the meeting. The shot would not be attempted as a planned element of the operation. If the operation proceeded and the target presented himself, engagement would occur through other means, ground assault, closer range engagement from a more advantageous position, or not at all if the opportunity did not permit safe and probable execution. This decision reflected professional judgment, risk assessment, and the kind of cautious deliberation that characterized well-managed military planning in an environment where mistakes had consequences. The decision carried institutional weight. It was not a suggestion or a preference. It was an explicit determination that this particular engagement method would not be employed. The sniper understood this. Everyone in the planning room understood this. The operation would proceed under the clear understanding that the 800-meter shot was off the table, ruled out by the professional judgment of the planning staff, not to be attempted unless circumstances changed dramatically in a way that would trigger a replanning cycle. The SASR sniper present in the briefing room received this decision with apparent acceptance. He said nothing that disputed the conclusion. He asked no questions about the calculation or the assumptions underlying it. To all external appearances, he received the ruling as what it was, the professional judgment of the planning staff that this particular engagement fell outside the acceptable parameters of the operation. The meeting continued. Other details were finalized. The operation was set to proceed under the understanding that the long-range shot was off the table. The sniper appeared to accept this verdict and began focusing on the other aspects of his role in the operation. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe button to not miss any story. And check out our Patreon in the description. We post full uncensored stories there. Every graphic detail, every brutal moment, nothing redacted. Stories YouTube won't allow. Now let's get into it. The nature of sniper training and sniper culture provides essential context for what followed. A sniper in a special operations unit has typically undergone selection and training so comprehensive and so demanding that it constitutes a distinct tier of military expertise. The physical requirements are severe. Personnel must be capable of carrying significant weight over substantial distances. They must be capable of remaining still for extended periods because much of sniper work involves lying in position and observing, waiting for targets to appear. The psychological requirements, the ability to remain calm, focused, and emotionally controlled in circumstances that demand the highest level of precision and judgment, are equally exacting. A sniper must be capable of taking a life in cold blood when the tactical situation demands it, yet he must be capable of exercising restraint when firing would compromise the operation or create civilian casualties. The technical knowledge demanded of snipers extends far beyond simply being a good shot. A modern military sniper must understand ballistics at a level approaching physics. He must understand wind estimation, not just knowing what wind speed feels like, but being able to assess wind speed by observing effects on vegetation, dust, and atmosphere at various ranges. He must understand the mechanics of the rifle to a degree that approaches engineering. He must understand how to apply all of this knowledge under stress, when conditions are degraded, when information is imperfect, and when the consequences of failure are not simply personal failure, but operational failure or loss of life. The training that produces this capability spans years. Candidates selected for sniper training undergo months of intensive instruction. They learn the physics of ballistics, how to calculate bullet drop, how to compensate for the curvature of the earth at extreme distances, how to account for air density, temperature, and barometric pressure. They learn the mathematics of wind estimation and drift correction. They spend hundreds of hours with a rifle, shooting at known distances, then at unknown distances, then at moving targets, then at targets partially obscured by vegetation or terrain. They practice in rain, in snow, in extreme heat. They practice in darkness. They practice from positions that are uncomfortable and constraining. They learn to understand their own limitations through direct experience rather than through theory. The training regimen is relentless and is designed not simply to make them capable shooters, but to make them shooters who understand, at a cellular level, what is possible and what is not. The training is not conducted in controlled environments where everything can be managed and optimized. Much of it occurs in field conditions where the variables resist control and where the sniper must learn to adapt. The training that produces this capability inherently builds confidence in capability. A sniper who has trained to the level required for selection into a special operations regiment has done so precisely because he has spent hundreds of hours with a rifle, engaged in ballistic calculation and practice under every condition imaginable. He has taken shots at distances that approach or exceed those he will encounter in operations. He has done so in wind, in rain, in darkness, from positions that are uncomfortable and constrained. He has learned to understand his own limitations through direct experience rather than through theory, and implicitly, he has learned to trust that understanding. The training does not teach a sniper to be arrogant about his capability. Rather, it teaches him to understand precisely what he can and cannot do under various conditions. That understanding is not theoretical. It is grounded in repeated experience. The sniper in the briefing room, listening to the planning staff's assessment that 800 meters was beyond acceptable probability, possessed an intuitive knowledge of his own capability that was different in kind from the planning staff's theoretical calculation. The planning decision to rule out the 800-meter shot reflected the thinking of the planning staff as a whole. It represented a consensus judgment that the risk-benefit calculation did not favor the engagement. That judgment was not unreasonable. The planning staff had not been present for the sniper's training. They had not observed him practicing at 800 meters. They were working from theoretical calculations and ballistic tables. The planning staff's responsibility included ensuring that the operation succeeded and that personnel were not exposed to unnecessary risks. The decision reflected that responsibility. The planning staff could not afford to include engagements whose probability of success was below a certain threshold, because the inclusion of unreliable engagements in operation plans introduces variables that cannot be controlled. If the sniper missed, if the round went wide, the operation would degrade. The decision to exclude the shot was a reasonable answer to the constraints under which planners operate. But the sniper possessed additional information about his own capability that was not present in the planning room in the same concrete form. The planning staff had worked from ballistic tables and theoretical conditions. The sniper carried in his muscle memory and his trained intuition the feel of what he could do with his weapon under a wide range of conditions. He knew what 800 meters felt like from his training. He knew the rhythm and the skill required. The planning decision was based on probability and general principles. His knowledge was based on extensive direct experience. This was not a case of the sniper believing himself to be infallible. It was a case of the sniper having information, his own body's understanding of what it was capable of, that the planning process by its nature could not fully incorporate. When the operation unfolded, the target presented himself in a location and at a moment that created the opportunity for the long-range engagement. The sniper had repositioned himself to cover not only the primary engagement points but also the possible routes of the target, the secondary positions he might move to, and the escape routes he might attempt if he became aware of the presence of coalition forces. The sniper's positioning during the operation had been planned with the assumption that closer engagement would be possible, since that had been the planning emphasis, but he had positioned himself in such a way that he could engage the target at longer ranges if the opportunity presented itself. The tactical geometry of the target's location, the sniper's position, and the surrounding terrain created a set of conditions that differed from what had been anticipated during planning. The target was positioned differently. The sniper's actual position was slightly different from where it had been planned. The wind conditions at the moment of the operation differed from the projected conditions. All of these variables combined to create a specific set of circumstances that existed only in that moment. His anticipation of where the target might appear and his preparation for multiple engagement scenarios reflected the kind of advanced tactical thinking that characterized experienced sniper work. A professional sniper understands that actual operations will not unfold exactly as planned. Weather will be different. Targets will move in unexpected ways. Positions will have to be adjusted based on what is learned from reconnaissance or from the appearance of threats that were not anticipated. A sniper who only prepares for the exact scenario laid out in planning is a sniper who will often find himself unable to engage targets that appear in slightly different circumstances. The experienced sniper builds flexibility into his preparation. He identifies multiple positions from which he could engage a target. He considers how changing wind conditions would affect his ability to make the shot. He prepares mentally for a range of scenarios. When the actual moment comes, that preparation allows him to adjust and execute even if the exact circumstances are different from what planning anticipated. The sniper who does this well is not wasting time preparing for imaginary scenarios. He is building a repertoire of mental models and tactical solutions that allow him to respond effectively when circumstances diverge from plan. In a specific moment, the geometry aligned. The target was in a position from which the sniper could take the shot that had been ruled out in planning. The target was not static, he was moving, but his movement was predictable. The wind condition at that moment, in the sniper's professional judgment, was within the range of what he had compensated for in training. The range, while substantial, was one he had prepared for and trained for extensively. The sniper's position provided him a relatively stable firing platform. The moment contained in the sniper's assessment a convergence of conditions that made the shot tactically feasible. The decision-making process that unfolded in the sniper's mind during those final moments before the shot was neither rapid nor casual, despite its brevity. The sniper's training had equipped him to make quick assessments, but those assessments were built on a foundation of methodical preparation. The conditions had to align: the target's position, the wind, the range, the sniper's physical readiness. Each of these variables had to fall within a range that the sniper had experienced and trained for. The sniper began with a rapid environmental assessment. What was the actual wind doing at ground level? What did he observe in dust, vegetation, and air movement that told him about wind speed and direction at the target location? How did the actual conditions compare to the historical averages that had been discussed in planning? The answer to that assessment proved significant. The wind at the moment of observation was lighter than the historical average that had informed the planning consensus. The lower wind meant less drift, which narrowed the margin of error and made the shot more probable than the planning models had suggested. This observation was not a minor quibble with the planning estimate. It was a material change in the ballistic calculation. A reduction in wind drift of even a few inches could mean the difference between a hit and a miss at 800 meters. The sniper then assessed the target's location and movement. Where exactly was the target? Was he moving or stationary? If moving, What was the pattern of movement, and could it be anticipated? The sniper's training had prepared him for exactly this kind of assessment. He was skilled at rapid range estimation, at understanding how movement would affect the calculation, at predicting where a moving target would be at the moment the round would arrive. The target was moving, but the pattern of movement was predictable. The sniper could anticipate where the target would be when the round reached that distance. This was not simple calculation, it was the intuitive understanding that comes from hundreds of hours of training and practice. The sniper did not need to consciously perform ballistic mathematics. His training had internalized the calculations to the point where they felt intuitive. He observed the target, he observed the movement, and he immediately understood where the target would be when the round arrived. The sniper then assessed his own physical and psychological state. How was his breathing? Was his position stable? Could he maintain the precision required? Was his mind clear and focused? Could he execute the shot without flinching, without hesitation, without second-guessing? This self-assessment was critical. The decision the sniper had to make was not simply whether the shot was theoretically possible. It was whether he could personally execute it in the psychological and physical state he was currently in. The assessment appears to have been affirmative. The sniper felt capable. His position was solid. His mind was clear. His preparation had equipped him for this moment. He had performed this assessment dozens of times in training, and he had learned to recognize the conditions under which he could execute and the conditions under which he could not. The final piece of the decision was whether engaging with the shot served the operation's purpose. The operation's goal was to eliminate or capture the target. If the shot succeeded, the operation would be advanced. If the shot failed, if the round went wide and the target survived, the operation would become significantly more complex. But the sniper's assessment of his capability and the conditions suggested that the probability of success was higher than the planning consensus had calculated. The sniper understood that the planning consensus had been conservative, working from averages and uncertainties. He was working from the actual conditions of the moment, observed directly. The planning consensus had been made by people who were not present in the moment and who had to work from assumptions. The sniper was present. He could observe. He could assess. His information was superior to the information available during planning. The decision that the sniper made in that moment was made alone. There was no radio consultation with the commander. There was no request for permission. There was, according to accounts, a rapid internal calculation in which the sniper assessed the conditions, the wind, the position of the target, the range, his own state and capability, and determined that the probability of success was higher than the planning consensus had calculated it to be. He possessed additional information, the current wind conditions as he perceived them by observing effects on vegetation, dust, and the air itself at the target location and along the trajectory of the intended round. He possessed the exact position of the target, not estimated from planning documents but actually observed. He possessed knowledge of his own mental and physical state at that moment, his level of fatigue, his alertness, his ability to maintain focus. He possessed the psychological readiness that comes from being prepared for precisely this circumstance. The planning room had worked from averages and general principles. The sniper worked from the specific conditions of the moment. This was not a matter of the sniper ignoring the planning guidance out of arrogance. It was a matter of the sniper applying superior information to a decision that could only be made by the person with access to that information. The decision itself reflected a kind of professional judgment that is difficult to quantify, but that emerges from training and experience. The sniper was not making a reckless decision. He was not ignoring the planning guidance because he believed himself to be infallible or because he wanted to defy the planning staff. Rather, he was making a rapid assessment of circumstances as they actually existed in the moment, comparing that assessment to his knowledge of his own capability, not theoretical capability but practical capability based on hundreds of hours of training and practice. He was concluding that the specific conditions at the specific moment were more favorable than the general conditions that had been analyzed during planning. Planning had to work from assumed conditions. The sniper worked from actual conditions. The difference mattered. The sniper was not rejecting the planning staff's reasoning. He was applying that reasoning to a different data set, the real data of the moment rather than the projected data of the planning phase. It was the kind of decision that only a sniper with extensive training and confidence in his own judgment would make. It was not a decision made in arrogance. It was a decision made in the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing that you have trained extensively for this exact moment. It was also the kind of decision that could go wrong. If the shot missed, if the round went wide, if the target was injured but not killed, the operation would become significantly more complex. The target would be warned and would flee or would fight. Coalition forces would be compromised. Their position would be revealed. The entire operation might fail. The sniper understood this. He was not ignorant of the risk. He was accepting that risk based on his assessment that the probability of success was higher than the planning staff had calculated. The sniper was not hoping that the shot would work. He was assessing the probability that it would work and determining that the probability was acceptable. The moment arrived. The sniper's breathing synchronized with his heartbeat. His finger moved to the trigger. The breathing pause before the shot was the practice sequence that every sniper learns and practices hundreds of times. Exhale, hold, squeeze. The round was chambered. The firing sequence began. The trigger press itself was a study in controlled mechanics. The sniper had trained to execute the shot with a smooth, even pressure that would not disturb his sight picture or his aim. The gun itself would recoil. That was inevitable, but the recoil had to occur after the bullet had left the barrel, not before. The timing of the trigger press relative to the breath cycle, the steadiness of the aim, the alignment of the sights, all of this had to come together in a fraction of a second. The training had prepared the sniper to execute these coordinated actions without conscious deliberation. He took the shot. The report of the rifle, the recoil impulse against his shoulder, the momentary loss of visual acuity as his eye registered the recoil, and then the briefest moment of silence, the fraction of a second before the result became apparent. 800 meters of air and gravity stood between the barrel of the rifle and the target. The round had a trajectory that would carry it slightly upward for the first 100 meters, then begin a gradual descent as gravity asserted itself. The wind would carry it sideways, the amount of drift depending on the wind speed and direction along the trajectory. The round would lose velocity as air resistance acted on it. When it reached 800 meters, it would have lost a significant portion of its original velocity. Whether it retained enough velocity and trajectory to strike the target depended on all of these factors, many of which could only be estimated. The Allied observers positioned nearby to monitor the operation witnessed the moment in a different way. They could see the target, they could see the sniper's position. They could not directly hear the shot from where they were positioned, though the sound would reach them eventually from the acoustic signature of the rifle. What they observed in the critical moment was the target's response. The target, an instant before, had been engaged in activity, movement, observation, or communication. An instant after the sniper's trigger press, that activity ceased. The target went down. The engagement had succeeded. An 800-meter shot that had been ruled out in planning had connected. The observers understood what had happened. They understood that the sniper had made a decision that the planning staff had determined should not be made. And they understood that the decision had been correct. The round struck the target. The engagement succeeded. The sniper, in that fraction of a second in which he pulled the trigger, had made a tactical decision that overrode the collective professional judgment of the planning staff. He had determined that their assessment of probability was conservative and that the specific conditions at that specific moment warranted an engagement despite the formal ruling that it should not be attempted. The outcome validated his judgment. The target was down. The operation continued as planned. The shot, which had been ruled out in the planning room, had been successful in the field. What followed was a peculiar institutional moment. The after-action report documenting the operation would need to address what had occurred. The sniper had violated the explicit decision made in planning, but the shot had connected. The outcome was the one desired, the target eliminated, the operation advanced, no friendly casualties, no civilian incidents. An after-action review that sanctioned the sniper for ignoring planning guidance would simultaneously be validating his judgment because the outcome demonstrated that his assessment of probability had been. Conversely, the review could not simply ignore the fact that a direct decision had been overridden by personnel in the field. According to accounts of how the matter was subsequently handled, the after-action report confirmed the success of the shot and recorded what had occurred with apparent professional acceptance. The documentation seems to have understood the event not as insubordination, but as an example of what happened when personnel possessed of exceptional training and judgment encountered circumstances that were marginally more favorable than what planning had anticipated, and made a decision informed by their specific experience and capability. The report validated the outcome and, implicitly, validated the sniper's judgment. The professionalism with which the after-action report handled the situation seemed to understand that second-guessing the sniper's decision after it had succeeded would amount to disciplining him for being right. The after-action report included analysis of the conditions at the moment the shot was taken. The wind speed that had been observed at the sniper's position was measured and compared to the historical average that had informed the planning consensus. The assessment confirmed what the sniper had concluded in the moment. The actual wind was lighter than the assumed wind, which improved the probability of the shot succeeding compared to what the theoretical planning models had calculated. The wind speed reduction had a material effect on the calculation. The planning models had assumed a wind condition that created roughly 30 inches of drift at 800 meters. The actual wind observed on the day of the operation created approximately 18 inches of drift. That 14-inch difference was the margin between a shot that planning had deemed unreliable and a shot that the sniper had deemed feasible. The sniper had visually estimated the wind speed with enough accuracy that his judgment was vindicated by the post-operation measurement and analysis. The report did not simply accept the outcome, it validated the methodology by which the sniper had made his assessment. The report examined the sniper's assessment of his own capability, noting that his training record and his experience provided a basis for confidence that was not equivalent to the planning staff's more conservative estimate. The documentation reviewed the sniper's training log, which showed extensive practice at ranges exceeding 800 meters, conducted in conditions of wind and light variation similar to what had been encountered in the operation. The report addressed the decision-making process, noting that the sniper had made a rapid but methodical assessment of the conditions and his capability, and had determined that the moment represented a tactical opportunity that the formal planning guidance had missed because the planning guidance had to work from assumed rather than actual conditions. The report's analysis seemed to recognize that the sniper had, in a sense, possessed better real-time information than the planning process could provide, and had made a judgment grounded in that superior information. The after-action documentation included explicit acknowledgement that the sniper's assessment had been more accurate than the conservative planning estimate, and that his decision to take the shot, while made in violation of explicit planning guidance, had resulted in successful mission accomplishment. The report seemed to suggest that the planning staff, had they possessed the sniper's real-time information, would have made the same decision. This outcome reflected a particular command culture within special operations units. The rule had been established. The sniper had understood it. He had not challenged it in the planning room. He had not requested an exception. He had not asked for permission to attempt the shot. Instead, he had maintained his own assessment of what was possible and attempted the engagement when circumstances aligned favorably. The response from the command structure was not to enforce the rule retroactively, but to recognize that the tactical judgment of the sniper in the specific moment had been sound. The organization had established a rule. A subordinate had violated the rule. The rule's violation had produced a successful outcome. The organization's response was to accept the outcome and to understand it as an example of tactical judgment rather than as a breach of discipline. This did not mean the organization would tolerate random violation of orders. It meant the organization understood that rules and planning guidance provide a framework within which judgment operates, not a cage that constrains it. The institutional discussion that followed appears to have recognized that the planning guidance, while based on sound reasoning and conservative calculation, had been superseded by actual operational conditions that were more favorable than the planning process had anticipated. The planners could not have known that the wind would be lighter. They could not have known the exact positioning that the target would adopt. They could not have made real-time assessments of the sniper's physical and psychological state. These were knowable only by the sniper himself in the moment. The planning process had been necessary and appropriate. It had established a framework for decision-making and had identified which engagements were appropriate to plan for and which should be avoided. But the planning process, by its nature, had to be conservative, had to assume middle-range conditions, had to incorporate uncertainty factors. When actual conditions proved to be more favorable than the planning assumptions, the question became whether personnel in the field should be constrained by planning assumptions that had been rendered obsolete by operational reality. The organization's answer appeared to be no, not when the personnel making the decision possessed the training and judgment to make it responsibly. The implications of this approach to command and authority deserve examination. In a strictly hierarchical system, personnel are expected to obey decisions made by higher authority, and the fact that the lower-ranked person's decision turned out to be correct does not retroactively validate ignoring the order. The structure of such a system depends on obedience, on the chain of command being clear and being followed, on decisions being made at the appropriate level and then executed. That system has considerable strengths. It ensures consistency. It provides clear accountability. It prevents individual judgment from creating chaos when units operate in complex, coordinated environments. But special operations units, by their nature, operate in circumstances where centralized decision-making has inherent limitations. The sniper in the field possessed information that the planning staff did not possess: his direct perception of the wind, the exact angle of the target, the precise distance accounting for specific terrain features. He possessed intuitive knowledge about what his own system could do that was more precise than what ballistic tables could communicate. He possessed the capability to make a rapid assessment and execute under pressure. If such personnel are to be truly effective, they cannot be constrained by a requirement to request permission for every tactical decision that falls outside explicit planning guidance. The culture that permitted the sniper's decision, and that subsequently validated it through the after-action report, represented a particular philosophy about how to organize special operations forces. It presumed that the selection and training processes had filtered for personnel capable of sound judgment. It recognized that time-sensitive tactical decisions cannot always wait for approval to propagate through radio networks and command hierarchies. It accepted that rules and planning guidance provide a framework, but that the tactical moment sometimes demands decisions made by the person with the most information and the most immediate understanding of the situation. This philosophy rested on the understanding that the person with the most information is not always the person with the most authority. This was not a system that worked without careful constraints. The personnel involved had to be exactly the kind that selection and training produced: individuals capable of making sound decisions under stress, confident enough in their knowledge not to panic, trained enough to understand when they should deviate from planning and when they should not. The system depended on alignment between the planning guidance and the field reality being close enough that deviation could occur without cascading into chaos. And it depended on the command structure being wise enough to recognize sound judgment when it resulted in successful outcomes, rather than treating every deviation from planning as insubordination that required punishment. The reaction of Allied forces to this chain of events, according to available accounts, appears to have been professional recognition of what had occurred. Personnel from other nations' military forces who reviewed the action seem to have understood the sniper's decision not as a failure of discipline, but as an example of the kind of tactical judgment that special operations training was designed to produce. There was a technical soundness to what the sniper had done. He had made a calculation. He had assessed the conditions. He had possessed the training and capability to execute. He had done so, and it had succeeded. The fact that this contradicted explicit planning guidance was noted, but the fact that it succeeded seemed to be understood as a validation of his judgment. The broader narrative that this episode illuminated concerned the difference between cultures of obedience and cultures of competence. A military organization can function by establishing rules and requiring strict obedience to them. Personnel follow orders. Authority makes decisions. Personnel execute those decisions. That system has been the foundation of military organization for centuries, and it remains essential for ensuring that complex operations proceed in coordinated fashion. But a different culture is possible, one in which personnel are selected and trained to understand not just the letter of orders, but the purpose behind them, and are trusted to make tactical adjustments when circumstances align in ways that better serve that purpose. The sniper's shot at 800 meters, ruled out in planning, taken anyway in the field, confirmed as successful in the after-action report, was an example of what that second culture could produce. It was not chaos. It was not capricious decision-making. It was a highly trained individual operating at the edge of his capability, making a judgment informed by intensive preparation and experience, and having that judgment validated by the outcome and by the institutional recognition that his assessment had been sound. The rule had been established. It had been broken. The rules ultimately survived because the person who broke them did so intelligently and successfully, and the command structure was wise enough to understand the difference between necessary obedience and necessary judgment. In the larger context of the Afghanistan campaign, this was one engagement among thousands, and it remained largely unrecorded in the public narrative of the war. But it illustrated something important about how special operations units functioned, how they thought about authority and judgment, and how they operated in the space between the rules and the reality of what needed to happen. The sniper in that moment faced a decision that no planning room could make for him. He could follow the explicit guidance that had been given, or he could apply his training and his judgment to a set of conditions that were marginally more favorable than the planning consensus had anticipated. He chose the latter. The command structure, seeing the outcome, validated that choice. It was a small moment in a war that contained many small moments like it, each one reflecting a particular understanding of how military organizations should work when they want small numbers of highly trained personnel to accomplish difficult, complex tasks in ambiguous circumstances where the full information available to the command structure is never as complete as the information available to the person doing the task. The sniper understood that rules exist for reasons. He also understood that rules are made by people working with incomplete information, and that the moment when a rule should be broken is when the person with complete information judges that breaking the rule serves the rule's purpose better than following it.